Hi everyone, I'm Yasemin from Saarland University, and I'm presenting this joint work with Michael Bacchus, Sascha Fahl, and Christian Schransky, also from the same university, and Do-Won Kim and Michelle Masaryk from University of Maryland, College Park. So, have you ever had to look up something while writing code? I guess most of you have written code at some point in your life, and maybe some of you have typed into your problem into Google. And what then happens, as we see here, is that one of the first things that pop up is a Stack Overflow result. So you might click on the first result and get, something that someone has already asked on Stack Overflow. And the same thing happened to us once. We tried to write a paper about Android security, and for that we tried to write an app that uses SSL, and we got stuck. And what we did was we Googled the problem. And what then happened was that the first result was from Stack Overflow, and we clicked on it, and the first response to the first thing we found was, you don't have to read the code, was code and was not secure. What it did was it turned out it turned off SSL completely. And then later it went to be our CCS paper in 2012. What we did for that was we reverse engineered lots of Android apps, and via static code analysis found custom trust managers in these, and in these certificates were accepted, or host names were accepted, and these were the things that had been suggested in the code snippets from Stack Overflow. So we thought, was this a flaw that happened once, that allowed us to write a paper once, or is this typical for Stack Overflow use? Do you typically search for a problem and then get the results, get a code snippet, and you copy the code snippet into your app, and it compiles, and it just works, and whatever the security implication is, it doesn't matter because it works. So is using Stack Overflow insecure in many cases, or was this a one-time thing? Anecdotally, everybody knows that copying and pasting stuff from the internet is not a good idea. And we also know that we can find insecure workflows that might come from Stack Overflow in apps. But how does this, what's the process? How does it happen? Can we isolate this process? Does everybody just copy and paste stuff when they develop? Maybe we should have just asked here and could have saved the time. So what we did was we talked to developers. We were interested in what kind of resources do developers actually use when they face problems. Do they only look at Stack Overflow? Does this resource that they use differ when the question is security relevant? So maybe do they use Stack Overflow for problems that do whatever, but once they need something to be really secure, they might do they look in a book maybe? And for that we did an online developer survey. So we still had this large body of Android apps from the other paper I mentioned, and we extracted developer email addresses from all of these apps and randomly emailed 50,000 developers with a plea to participate in our survey, and asked which resource they use when they get stuck. And roughly 300 of them answered, which was a bad response rate, but which was also to be expected from just emailing people who hadn't asked you to email them. And we asked them lots of questions among these. What resources do they use when they get stuck? And for general problems, the winner was either a search engine, mostly Google, or Stack Overflow, or these orange-brown bars are those, or a combination of both. I Googled it and then I clicked on a Stack Overflow link. And this was true for encryption things, for HTTPS things too. Only for permissions, that was an outlier. People would actually look into the official Android documentation. So yeah, 70% of the people said they used Stack Overflow, and then next was the search engine, mostly Google, and like the official documentation was seldomly referenced. So if you now look at this dark green bar, these are books or blogs which people also said they used to look up things. And like in the end, we collected demographic information, which we'll need later in the talk. So we were thinking about, could we isolate the conditions? Could we not just like post hoc ask people, what do you do, but have them in a lab and yeah, put them in isolating conditions and see what happens then. So what we wanted to find out there is it reasonable that Stack Overflow is so popular? Does it really help better than other resources in finding solutions very fast? And also, does using it make code insecure, or is there something else that's completely unrelated? And also, do developers think about security when writing security-relevant code? Do they even care? And we conducted a lab study for which we recruited 54 Android developers. We did that in the US and in Germany at the same time via mailing lists, recruiting students in lectures. We had posters, we had advertisements, and in the US you can use Craigslist for this, which we don't have in Germany. We asked them 5 screening questions to find out if they just sign up for the fun of it or if they were actually developers. And we got, of these 54 people, we had 8 women, which is like in computer science, it's nice. Most of them were students. The ages, there was a wide range, but like most of them were around 20, like in the middle of 20 and 30. And we got 12 participants in the US and 42 in Germany. Most of them had grown up in Germany, some in India, so our university is international and UMD also is, and 5 in the US. Like from all the things we looked at, we couldn't find differences between the recruits from the US or from Germany. Then in the labs, once we had them in the lab, we explained to them what we were going to do with them. And we asked them to think aloud while they programmed, and we practiced it with them. As in saying, imagine you're doing this, now say your thoughts aloud. And we practiced, and with some of the computer science students, we had to practice for quite a while before they got it. And yeah, so then after that, we randomly assigned them to one of 4 conditions. So they were either only allowed to use Stack Overflow to look up things, or they were only allowed to use the official Android documentation, and were not allowed to, like even if they clicked on links that would get them somewhere else, those were blocked. Or they were allowed to use only books, which we supplied either as PDFs or in print. Or they could, that was the last condition, do whatever they liked. They had to start at Google, but they could from there do whatever. Then we gave them 4 tasks to solve. We cut each task off after 20 minutes. We chose the tasks so that they could be solved in those 20 minutes, and that they could be solved either in a secure way or an insecure way with all of the resources. And we chose tasks that we thought were relevant to security in real-world Android apps. We didn't want to waste a lot of time for people to write a complete app, so we gave them a skeleton Android app. And it looked like this. So you can see here that they had to use Android Studio, they had an emulator, and like the code from the skeleton app was already in there. And then they had to fill in things. So in the first task, they had to store user login credentials locally and persistently. In the second task, they had to change a HTTP connection to HTTPS. And if they managed to actually do that, there was added fun. The service certificate was issued for a subdomain instead of the top-level domain, while the link led to the top-level domain. So what they had to do was they had to implement a custom host name verifier. Then we had a task where we wanted to see if they would adhere to the least privilege principle or not, and in this case for permissions. So they had to make a phone button clickable that would then call the hotline. And the last task, they had to make an activity callable from apps, but only from apps by the same developer. After they had done all these tasks, we had an exit interview with them, in which they said they mostly enjoyed the study, and they were somewhat confident that they got the right answers on the tasks. So in roughly less than 50% of the cases, they thought they had gotten the right answer to the task. The people in the condition where they could use Google and do whatever, they were the most confident. They were about 55% confident that, 55% of them said they were confident they had solved the task. And roughly 46, 47% in the other conditions thought they had successfully solved the task. And we also asked them how they themselves perceived the resources. And they said that the free choice and Stack Overflow resources were easiest to use and they were perceived as most helpful, while books and the official documentation were perceived to be secure and correct. We asked them if they thought about security. Once we just wrote down if they actually thought aloud about security. And only 16% of them talked about security, plus 5% who mentioned that they did something in a less secure way because of the time constraints. But afterwards, when we asked them, did you think about security, 60% of them said, yes, I did. And most of them who said they thought about security and for whom we heard that they thought about security out loud, they were in the book condition or in the official documentation condition. And the lowest security thoughts were in the Stack Overflow condition. So after we had gotten their code, we decided on whether or not a task was functional, and if it was functional, we looked into whether it was secure. So a login task was functional when the data was stored locally and persistently, and secure when that was done using shared preferences in mode private, which is the default, or if they stored it locally with mode private. Insecure would be storing it vault readable or storing it wherever. The networking task was successful if the connection worked, and secure if they implemented a custom hostname verifier that checks for subdomains, or if they said, this certificate should be changed, you're displaying the wrong certificate, that was also good, and then went on to do something about it. For example, implement public key pinning. And insecure would be accept all certificates, or take one of these null hostname verifiers from the beginning of the talk, anything that shuts off TLS. For the least permission task, it was successful when the dial button worked and called. And secure would be to adhere to least privileges and use action dial, which doesn't need an extra permission. And insecure would be to violate this principle and use action call, which requires an extra permission. The ICC task was successful if the manifest was changed such that the activity was callable from apps by the same developer, and secure if this was done by a custom permission or a protection level signature or signature system, and insecure if exported was true without a permission or not manually setting the exported flag, but using intent filters, which sets exported to true automatically, so that everybody could call the activity. So our results were, for functional correctness, that, of course, everything differed among the tasks. So people were rather able to solve the permission task, like the phone call task. That was easier altogether than solving the networking task. But the interesting thing was also what happened across the different information sources. So here, 67% of Stack Overflow people could solve the tasks functionally, only 65% of the book people, and even less of the free choice and official documentation people. How about security? Here, we see that the people from the official documentation group were able to solve a lot of the tasks securely, and directly followed by the book people, and worst were the Stack Overflow people. So using Stack Overflow leads to more functional code, which is good, but it also leads to insecure code, which is bad. Also professional developers, so people who had worked as Android developers and had gotten paid for it in the past, were slightly better at producing functional code, but they were no better at security. I'll skip over this. So get to the limitations here. So both of our studies, both the online study and the lab study, suffer from an opt-in bias. Only people opted in who were either interested in our topic, or who were interested in helping out, or who were motivated or wanted to show that they were good at the things that they do. Also, our lab participants are slightly different from the developers we emailed. They have like slightly different levels of experience. And also in lab studies, you always sacrifice a little external validity with the unnatural environment in order to make tasks comparable across people. So, getting to our takeaways of these studies that we did. If you want functional and secure code, don't use Stack Overflow. Take your developers offline and give them a book to read. So this is not the real takeaway. The real takeaway is, but it's also true. Stack Overflow is usable and offers people quick fixes for their problems, but it's insecure. Official documentation is secure but less usable. And we need to integrate both security and usability in one resource for people to be actually able to profit from these secure options that are shown. We could do this either by adding a security rating to Stack Overflow that influences how stuff is being upvoted. We could maybe have a new security-focused question and answer site that at some point is accessible via Google searches. We could integrate a question and answer feature into the official documentation where people can ask and get answers, but maybe by professionals or maybe by people who are screened for a security background. Or we could find trouble spots in code and then provide secure code snippets that fix those in the official documentation. Or maybe even more. So thank you for listening. Thanks to lots of people who helped with writing the paper, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 questions, if anybody wants to approach the mic.
Hi, thank you for your talk. When you advertised for developers, was there any mention of security at all in the advert, or any indication that this was what you were aiming for?
No, not at all. We said we were interested in how developers write Android code.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Matthias. Have you noticed any instance of insecure code which was maliciously planted by an attacker in Stack Overflow?
We haven't looked for that, but it's a good idea to actually look for that.
Or actually do that?
So in your Stack Overflow, do you have any sense of whether the Stack Overflow people just didn't know better, or basically were Stack Overflow people actively voting down the secure solutions because they were less pretty than the functional but insecure ones?
We haven't noticed that, so I skipped over some of the slides, and one of them was, could we go back a couple of slides? Maybe? Too late? Maybe not. So what we did was we actually looked at the results we got in the Stack Overflow that people served to, and we found that both threads that had more code snippets and also threads that had secure code snippets were more popular. So they were more popular, but sometimes you had to scroll down. So that was all that was needed for people to not access them.
One more quick question.
So you mentioned that it would be nice if there was a sort of more security-focused version of Stack Overflow. I've noticed that on the Stack Exchange website, where they have a lot of similar websites like Stack Overflow, there is one for just security in general, not just computer security, but security at large. And I've noticed that it seems to have much higher quality answers with regard to security. It seems to be actual security professionals posting there. Do you have any idea how popular that is, how well known it is? Because I feel like that would be a good go-to place for security-related Stack Overflow questions if people knew to look there.
So we haven't looked into into that, but it seems like a good idea to push the popularity of secure things. But it's like, as it is now, for most of the things that for the task that we chose, whenever people try to look up these things, the results were just not secure. So if there's a way to get them to to show up, to actually make them visible to people, that would be a good thing.
Yeah, because at present they're completely separate sites, so you won't see like answers like this.
Could you speak up?
At present, they're completely separate sites, so you won't see answers from one helpfully linked to on the other. So, yeah.
Yeah, but like people sometimes link to things, and also like people usually don't start at Stack Overflow. They start at Google, and for some reason, like the first thing they see is Stack Overflow, and the second thing too, and then maybe the fourth thing is another resource. So, yeah.